Well, hello everybody. My name is Jason DeCosta. Thank you for joining me today on my show called Consistent Preterism. I didn't have any opening intro music because I just picked up my dog. He's in the back seat. I'm just kind of cruising home with him, and just too much going on to be able to do that also. So no intro music, but just wanted to talk about something today. Hopefully shouldn't take too long, but you never know. What I wanted to talk about was Galatians 3, the end of Galatians 3, where Paul says, "And if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise," right? So people look at that portion and they're all confused. They actually have it all ass backwards, okay? And what I mean by that is they look at that statement by Paul and they think that it means if you are Abraham's seed, it's because you are Christ. In other words, in order to be Abraham's seed, you must be Christ's. But actually, it's the other way around. Okay, it's actually, in order to be Christ, you had the prerequisite for that was you had to be Abraham's seed. Okay, so people have it backwards. They say, "Oh, you become a seed of Abraham when you have faith in Christ." But actually, the real understanding and the proper interpretation of that passage, which I willingly admit not many people have been able to interpret throughout the years because they're reading through a very biased lens, where they think that this is a story about them. But it isn't a story about them. It's a story about the salvation of Israel. And when you read that passage, the proper way to read it would be, "And if you are Christ's, it is because you are Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise." Right? So Abraham, the promise was made to Abraham's seed, to his descendants in the beginning. He would bless them. They would become a multitude of peoples, and he would bless them in the end. And we see the fulfillment of that in Revelation 7, where the ones from all nations are standing redeemed, and that was about to take place. But the focus of this is to explain that passage. "And if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise." Okay? So, first thing that we want to mention here is that this portion in Galatians is actually written to the elect of the dispersion, the diaspora. All right, the entire book is actually written to the diaspora. And how do we know that? Well, we do a little bit of kind of tying and piecing things together, and we can see this very plainly. All right, so first we go to 1 Peter chapter 1. And the Bible's cool because you're not going to find everything you need to find in one letter or in one epistle. You actually have to go to other letters, other epistles, and you have to kind of weave the facts together to formulate the story. And I think that's why I've become a bit obsessed with figuring out the Bible, is because it's such a giant puzzle, right? It's like the ultimate puzzle on steroids. And I always kind of like puzzles. And this one just really requires you to piece things together. And little by little, every day, you kind of piece different things together and the story becomes clearer and clearer. So we go to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, and we see what Peter says there. He says, "Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father." So we see Peter addressing the ones out in the nations, and he refers to Galatia as being part of those whom he is addressing. But notice whom he defines these saints are. He says they are elect pilgrims of the dispersion. Now, would anyone dare to argue that the dispersion refers to dispersed pagans? Of course not. That's stupid. All right, the dispersion is the dispersed Israelites out in the nations. Okay, everybody knows this. This is not a secret. So when Peter opens up addressing to the elect of the dispersion, he's basically saying, I am writing to the elect Israelites out in the nations, of which one of those is Galatia. Now, I know you're probably thinking, well, that doesn't mean Paul also wrote to them in his epistle to the Galatians, right? Well, wrong. Okay, so Peter actually tells us that Paul wrote to the same audience. All right, so let's take a look. We know Peter was writing to the dispersed Israelites, Galatia being one of them. And when we look at 2 Peter chapter 3, we can actually see that Paul also wrote to these same people. these same dispersed Israelites. Because Peter says this in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "Beloved, I now write to you in this second epistle." So we know he's writing to the same people as he did in 1 Peter, in the first epistle. So he's still writing to the elect dispersed Israelites in the nations. And he says, "Therefore, beloved, looking forward to these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, without spot and blameless. And consider that the long-suffering of our Lord is salvation." Ready? "As also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given to him, has written to you as in all of his epistles, speaking of these things." So Peter very clearly says that Paul also wrote to these same ones in all of his epistles about the same exact things. So if Peter's writing to the elect in Galatia, obviously there's only one body of elect in Galatia, right? There's one group of called out ones in Galatia. Then clearly Paul also wrote to that same group of elect ones in Galatia. Peter flat out says it. So that means that Paul, in all of his epistles, also wrote to the elect of the dispersion. Now, unless you can show us where pagans were dispersed in this story and promised to be gathered in and saved and everything, then you have a big problem. Because that just takes all of Paul's epistles and wraps them up neatly and puts them in a little basket with a bow on it and says, hey, these are all written to elect dispersed Israelites. All right, now, so we see clearly that Paul was also writing to the elect of the dispersion. So when we look at Galatians chapter 3, and we see him say that if they were Christ, they were Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise, we can kind of see what he's doing, right? He's writing to these so-called Gentiles out in Galatia, and he tells them, if you're Christ, it means that you're Abraham's seed, or it's because you are Abraham's seed. It means that you've descended from Abraham, and you are an heir according to the promise that God made to Abraham at the beginning, that in his literal seed, they would be blessed. All right, so that ties up wonderfully if you look at it. But now let's try to think of Revelation 7 with the great multitude, right? I did a teaching the other day on it. Got a lot of nice feedback on that. But people say that Revelation 7 is not the Israelites, right? They think that the great multitude from all nations is not the Israelites. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, like my video the other day showed. First of all, you have this great multitude being saved shortly. It was at hand when John wrote, so we know that it can't be pushed out into the future. Secondly, you have the angels saying that these are the ones who come out from the Great Tribulation. And of course, as preterists, we know when that Great Tribulation was, according to Jesus. It was in the last days, and it would end at his coming. So we know that that great multitude had to come out from that Great Tribulation, that last days period. So it can't be anything future. But anyways, let's talk about the great multitude from all these nations that was about to be saved when John wrote in Revelation 7. What does he say about them? Well, he says a few things. He says they were one, they were a great multitude. He says two, they were from all nations, right? And three, he says they were unable to be measured or numbered. Now remember those three things as we proceed here. They were a great multitude, they were from all nations, and they were unable to be measured. Now, let's go back to the start of the story real quick in Genesis 48, and we see a promise that is made to Joseph about his two sons, okay, from Jacob, and Jacob says this to them. This is Genesis 48. It says, "But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He shall also become a people," he's speaking of Manasseh, "and he shall also be great. But truly his younger brother, Ephraim, shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So right away in Genesis 48, at the very beginning, we see that God makes a promise that Ephraim's descendants would become a multitude of nations. Now, for those of you who know what Ephraim is in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the term and the name Ephraim was used to describe the northern kingdom of Israel. And Ephraim is promised that his descendants would become a multitude of nations, or a multitude of goyim, meaning a multitude of different people. And clearly that's what Genesis 48 predicts, that his descendants would become a multitude of people. And clearly that's exactly what happened when the Assyrians came in, took control of the northern kingdom, dispersed all of those northern kingdom Israelites out into the nations, where they became a multitude of people. So that was literally fulfilled. All right? But now, that's just your first hint here to kind of tie this all together. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 4 and see what Moses predicted about the Israelites in the very beginning of the story as well. It says this in Deuteronomy 4:27 and forward. And the Lord will scatter you. This is Moses speaking to the Israelites. He says, and the Lord will scatter you, Israelites, among the peoples, or among the nations. And you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord will drive you. So there we see the Lord driving the Israelites out to the nations. And in those nations you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from those nations you will seek the Lord, and you will find him if you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. When you are in distress, and all these things come upon you, Israelites, in the latter days, when you turn to the Lord your God and obey his voice, for the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant that he made with your fathers. Wow, that's pretty powerful stuff right there. So in the beginning of this story, we see Moses make a prediction and a promise to the children of Israel that in the latter days, they would be out in the nations, scattered, dispersed, and they would be worshiping false gods and paganized and worshiping the work of men's hands, basically rejecting and neglecting Yahweh. But Yahweh would remember the covenant that he made with their fathers in the beginning, and he would call them back and have mercy upon them. The same mercy that we see being mentioned all throughout the New Testament in those last days, when God is having mercy upon these elect ones in the nations and forgiving their iniquity and removing their trespasses and nailing them to the cross, and going out and seeking the sheep that were like sheep led astray. They were going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd of their souls. So, do we see what Moses is doing there? All right, he's actually referring back to that promise. He's referring forward to a time in the latter days when God would remember the promise and the covenant that he made with Abraham. Now, let's go back to Galatians 3 again. Because Galatians 3, Paul tells them, if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise, according to the covenant promise. So when Moses predicted that God would remember the covenant promise that he made with their fathers in the last days and have mercy upon them, do you think that's related to Paul telling these ones in Galatia that if they were Christ, it was because they were Abraham's seed and an heir according to the promise God made to their fathers? Of course it relates. That's exactly what's going on here. Okay? It's a beautiful story, and it's fulfilling what Moses predicted. But now let's really hammer this home, shall we? So we already have the promise that Ephraim's descendants would become a multitude of nations, a multitude of people, which they did. Ephraim was the northern kingdom. They dispersed into the nations. They were literally scattered everywhere. They were dispersed. Okay, and then we have Moses predicting that the children of Israel would be in the nations in the latter days, worshiping false gods, not worshiping Yahweh, and God would remember their covenant and have mercy upon them in these latter days. So we have plenty of evidence that these Israelites out in the nations are the ones being saved in the last days already. But to really hammer this point home, we're just going to go to Hosea the prophet. Now, Hosea the prophet actually speaks of the children of Israel out in the nations, okay, in Hosea chapter 1. Now, keep those three things that I told you from Revelation 7 in the front of your mind when I read Hosea, okay? Don't lose sight of them. Those three things are that the children of Israel would be, those three things from Revelation 7 is that this people would be a great multitude, all right? They would be from all these nations, and they would not be able to be measured or numbered. All right, so keep those three things in mind. They're a great multitude, they're out in the nations, and they cannot be measured or numbered. And let's read Hosea chapter 1. Okay, Hosea says this, "Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea." Ready? which cannot be measured or numbered. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together. Okay, that's Hosea 1. So this is incredible. Do you see what he said? All right, here we see Hosea predict that at a time in the future, God was going to gather who? Well, it's right there, the children of Israel. And where was he going to gather them from? Yep, you guessed it, all the nations where he had driven them. And all the places where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, the same them, the children of Israel, you are sons of the living God. This is God calling them back from all the places where they were, from all the places where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it was going to be said to them, you are sons of the living God. All right, but notice he says that they would not be able to be measured. Well, Revelation 7 says the same thing. This was a great multitude from all nations that was not able to be measured. Okay? Now, again, that's the same exact thing. It's pulling. It's Revelation, great multitude from all nations unable to be measured, is pulling from Hosea 1, the great multitude of the children of Israel out in the nations unable to be measured. And remember, this is huge to remember here. The prophet says that in the places where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. But the context of Hosea is on the children of Israel all the way through. So those to whom God was saying, you are sons of the living God now, are the children of Israel out in the nations. Okay, that's plain as day. Okay, anybody can figure that out by seeing this presented properly. I'm sure you can too. So remember that you were not my people, but now you are my people, right? Now, do we recall where that's said elsewhere? We should, right? It's said a lot in the New Testament. For instance, Peter says that when he's writing to the elect in the nations in his epistles. Those of the dispersion, the pilgrims of the dispersion, in Pontus, Galatia, Asia Minor, Cappadocia, Bithynia, elect according to the foreknowledge of God. These are the ones that Peter's writing to, and he quotes Hosea's passage and applies it to them. He says, you were not a people, but now have become a people of God, the people of God. Okay, so he's pulling from Hosea and saying, hey, look, Hosea said that the children of Israel would at one time in the future be out in the nations, not God's people, but God would have mercy upon them and say they are now again God's people. And Peter says, hey, you saints out in the nations, in Bithynia, Galatia, Asia Minor, you are the ones that Hosea said would not be his people, but would be brought back. Do you know where else that phrase is used, that passage is pulled into? It's said by Paul to the Roman elect in Romans 9 as well. They were also the same ones who were once not a people but had now been brought back. And in fact, Paul even calls the Roman saints the children of Israel in chapter 9. Flat out. Clear as day. He says, is God also the God of the Gentiles? Meaning, is God also the God of the ones in the nations? And then he quotes this Hosea passage. It was said to them, you are not my people. There, now it is said to them, you are sons of the living God. He's basically saying, hey, you, Roman elect, you out in the nations, you Gentiles, you are the children of Israel from Hosea 1 being brought back. You are now the people of God in fulfillment of what Hosea said about the children of Israel. Then he goes on and he says, Isaiah also cries out concerning the children of Israel, though the remnant of them be left, or though they be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. This is Romans 9. So Paul is just lofting that up to people saying, hey, the Gentiles are Israelites. The Gentiles are Israelites. The saved Gentiles are Israelites. The converted Gentiles are scattered Israelites. But we can't pick that up because we're so steeped in indoctrination and thinking that places like Galatians 3 are speaking to us. Okay, but it's not. All right, this whole scenario is used over and over again to the nations that are being written to in the New Testament. They were the Once not my people, who are now my people of Hosea 1. They were the children of Israel out in the nations. All right, so the thing is that these people pluck these passages out of their larger narrative context. So they see Paul say there's no distinction between Jew and Gentile, but they're plucking that out from the foundation of what is going on. In other words, there's a mission here to gather all the children of Israel from wherever they were. Jew, Gentile, Greek, Italian, slave, free, it didn't matter. Paul was a debtor to all men. He was out there pulling them in from many different walks of life. So when Paul says there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, you have to understand that in that limited context. In other words, you have to understand that as Paul saying, no matter where you are, Abraham's descendant, no matter if you're a Jew, if you're a Greek, if you're a slave, if you're free, it doesn't matter because you're Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. Okay, you can't just pluck that passage out from the goal of the gospel commission, which was to gather the lost sheep of the house of Israel before his coming. All right, so when we see that, and we see places like Acts 2:38-39, which Peter specifically says, the promise is to you, Israel, to your children, Israel, and to all of you who are afar off, that scattered Israel, as many as our Lord will call, we have to let that portion define the other epistles for us. We can't say, okay, Peter says that the Israelites afar off are going to get the promise, but then when we come over to these passages in Ephesians and Colossians, oh, these must be real pagans. No. These are paganized Israelites being written to, the ones afar off. In fact, in Ephesians 2, Paul even says he came to preach peace to those who were near, the ones in Judea, and peace to you, Ephesians, who are afar off. Those are the same ones who are afar off in Acts 2. They're the scattered Israelites. They're the dispersion. But if we fail to see this, and if we fail to keep that at the forefront of our thinking when we get into these epistles and these New Testament letters, then we lose sight of the entire story, and we allow ourselves to think of any sort of combination of results or whatever we want the text to say, it can say. It doesn't matter because we lose sight of the mission that was at hand. And of course, most people don't even know what's back in the Old Testament, right? So Genesis 48, Ephraim's descendants becoming a multitude of peoples. Deuteronomy 4, Moses predicting that in the latter days the Israelites would be out paganized in the nations, but God would have mercy upon them. Hosea 1, the children of Israel being as the sand of the sea all over the nations, and God again having mercy upon them. They don't know that these passages even exist. 90% of Christians do not even know that those passages are laying there in the back of their Bibles, looking them in the face, saying, hey, look at me, because I'm giving you the answers to what's actually taking place in the New Testament last days before the end. So it's really just kind of unfortunate. And then you get bozos who come on my channel and try to argue and use passages like Galatians chapter 3 as if it's proving something. But it's not proving anything, because all you're doing is you're plucking that out of the greater narrative. And that greater narrative, as I just clearly showed you, was to gather all the elect of Israel from all nations where they were, whether they were Jew, whether they were Gentile, it didn't matter. If they were Christ's, it was because they were Abraham's seed and an heir according to promise. Anyways, that's all I got for you today, folks. I hope you all have a wonderful day. We'll be back another place, another time, another day, another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.